This is my subject for this evening, Dorothy Day. As Father Michael was saying, a great example of a lay apostle and a convert to Catholicism like myself. She is one of my Catholic heroes, and I don't make any apology for having spiritual heroes. That's what saints are for, whether they're canonized or not. And for me, she's up there with St. Teresa of Calcutta. I hasten to add that I'm not speaking really as an expert. I'm not a historian or a theologian. I'm an enthusiast, and I hope to put across that this is quite a personal thing for me. I'm also going to try and talk about another very big subject, which is Catholic social teaching, which I think many Catholics are not particularly aware of, but which they might be inspired by. And Lent is a good time to heed prophetic voices like Dorothy Day's and to consider the situation of the most marginalised in society, as she spent a lifetime doing. Dorothy Day made prayer, penitence and almsgiving the three pillars of Lent a way of life. I certainly think that these ideas that we're going to talk about this evening are very relevant today, and I think they are reflected and promoted in the teachings of our current Holy Father, Pope Francis. I think that this way of being a Catholic, the way of the Catholic worker, developed by Dorothy Day, is very radical. It's very demanding, and when you know that her story in full, a bit scary, but actually, when supported by prayer and the sacraments, entirely practical and has a huge incendiary potential to change society for the better. And that's why I've called it, my talk tonight, Exploding the Dynamite of Catholic Social Teaching, a phrase which comes from Dorothy's own writings. I've given her dates here, 1897 to 1980. You can see that Dorothy Day lived through the first 4/5 of the 20th century, which, as we know, were a time of war, a time of class war, a time of industrialization, and a time of consumption. And that latter we're paying the price for now. Anyone who's seen David Attenborough's program on the huge amount of plastic in the ocean will have seen this very clearly. Dorothy Day lived and worked her whole life in the United States, which is the controlling center of the world, certainly in the second half of the 20th century. And she could see, whilst the appearance was that people were very prosperous in that society, behind that appearance that one might see in the media was massive inequality, violence, and poverty, both material and spiritual. This period also saw 2 world wars, the invention of nuclear weapons, and the rise of civil rights and national liberation movements, all of which are documented in great detail in Dorothy's writings for the Catholic Worker and other journals. Next slide. So as Father Michael was saying, this talk has its origins in a retreat that I gave about 18 months ago at Dowie Abbey. It was at that point that I realised how relevant Dorothy Day was to my own life story and my pilgrimage as a Roman Catholic. And as I said, I'm not studying her as an academic, but that retreat was talking more about her writing than her actions. But I found that I tried to talk about her writing and ended up talking about her life, and the two were inseparable. I tried to be objective, and I found that my story was very much bound up with what I was reading, because I had a background, 20-year career working in social work and housing, particularly with people who are homeless, mentally ill, or with learning disabilities. So I was very keyed into the things that she was talking about. And I also had a background in, left-wing politics and the peace movement and things like that from when I was a youth. I believe Dorothy Day is a prophet in the very truest sense. She was ahead of her time, and she held power accountable, including power in the church. So I believe she has something to say about my life and faith and how I want to be a Catholic. Dorothy Day was a convert to Catholicism just like me. She was a convert from Marxism, just like me, although I'd wandered through 12-step groups and Buddhism by the time I came to the Catholic Church. Some people grow up thirsting for justice and mercy in a world that it seems obvious to us is neither just nor merciful. We seek a solution. We get angry. We find other angry people and we get involved in angry politics. And none of that really works until, for me, it didn't work until I met the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I found an answer to poverty, injustice, and war, particularly in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, in 2015, Pope Francis addressed both houses of the US Congress, and he he identified 4 people who he considered to be 4 of the greatest Americans. 2 of them could have been easily guessed at, Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King. We've all heard of them. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement in the States in the 50s and 60s. But the others would have been known to a much smaller number of people, and they were the monk, writer and mystic Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. Here's what the Holy Father had to say.
When it defends liberty, as Lincoln did, when it fosters a culture which enables people to dream of full rights for all brothers and sisters, as Martin Luther King sought to do. When it strives for justice and the cause of the oppressed, as Dorothy Day did by her tireless work, the fruit of a faith which becomes dialogue and sows peace in the contemplative style of Thomas Merton.
Later in his speech, the Pope returned to Dorothy Day, calling her a servant of God.
In these times, when social concerns are so important, I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Worker Movement. Her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. A century ago,
That's it. Lovely. Okay, Dorothy Day's story is one of conversion and then ever-deepening conversion for the rest of her life. She grew up in a lower middle-class family, but always felt a great solidarity with the poor. Perhaps this was because when she was 8 years old, she lived through the San Francisco earthquake and experienced homelessness and suffering for herself. Her growing disgust and outrage with the world she saw about her in the America of the early 20th century had led her into a lifestyle she did not respect. Although she had entertained vague spiritual yearnings in adolescence, her encounter with the revolutionary movement and the bohemian circle of friends that she found in New York City put paid to them. She was free-spirited and very ambitious to become a noted writer, and at that time was writing for left-wing newspapers and produced a first autobiographical novel in her 20s. After a number of unhappy love affairs, including with the playwright Eugene O'Neill, she found herself facing despair following an abortion and a suicide attempt. At the end of this first part of her life, she had a daughter, Tamar, with a man she really loved, but who was unable to commit to her because he did not believe in the institution of marriage. At this point, she was living in fairly extreme poverty on New York's Long Island, and with a newborn baby was dependent on the kindness of strangers, who in this case were a community of nuns living nearby. It was their non-judgmental acceptance of her that drew her inexorably towards the church. Perhaps, like me, she found an explanation for the lostness she had experienced in her life up until then, the long loneliness, as her autobiography was titled. Dorothy became convinced that Tamar must be baptized, much to the father's disapproval. But then, if the child, then why not her too? Here is an excerpt from The Long Loneliness describing this time of conversion. Dorothy writes, "No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. With this came the need to worship, to adore. I had heard many say that they wanted to worship God in their own way and did not need a church in which to praise him, nor a body of people with whom to associate themselves. But I did not agree to this. My very experience as a radical, my whole makeup led me to want to associate myself with others, with the masses, in loving and praising God. Without even looking into the claims of the Catholic Church, I was willing to admit that for me, she was the one true church. She had come down through the centuries since the time of Peter, and far from being dead, she claimed and held the allegiance of the masses of people in all the cities where I had lived. They poured in and out of her doors on Sundays and holy days, for novenas and missions. What if they were compelled to come in by the law of the church, which said they were guilty of mortal sin if they did not go to Mass every Sunday? They obeyed that law. They were given a chance to show their preference. They accepted the church. It may have been an unthinking, unquestioning faith, and yet the chance certainly came again and again. Do I prefer the church to my own will? Even if it was only in the small matter of sitting at home on a Sunday morning with the papers. And the choice for me was the church. So she was received into the Catholic Church and she attended Mass, went to confession and read widely on her faith. But the struggle for social justice was still important to her. She still wrote about it and reported on workers' struggles. How, she thought, might these two great passions of her life be connected? And I'm just going to read another quite short passage from The Long Loneliness. How little, how puny my work had been since becoming a Catholic, I thought. How self-centered, how ingrown, how lacking in sense of community. My summer of quiet reading and prayer, my self-absorption seemed sinful as I watched my brothers in their struggles, not for themselves, but for others. How our dear Lord must love them, I kept thinking to myself. They were his friends, his comrades, and who knows how close to his heart in their attempt to work for justice. I remembered that the first public act of our Lord recorded in the New Testament was the overthrowing of the money changers' tables in the temple. The miracle at Cana, where Christ was present at the wedding feast and turned water into wine, has been written off as the first public act of our Lord. It was the first miracle. It was the sanctifying of marriage, but it was not the social act of overturning the tables of the money changers, a divine courage on the part of this obscure Jew, going into the temple and with bold scorn for all the riches of this world, scattering the coins and the traffickers in gold. The demands of the marchers were for social legislation, for unemployment insurance, for old age pensions, for relief for mothers and children, for work. I remember seeing one banner on which was inscribed, "Work, not wages," a mysterious slogan having to do with man's dignity, his ownership of and responsibility for the means of production. The years have passed and most of the legislation called for by those workers is on the books now. I wonder how many realize just how much they owe the hunger marchers who endured fast and cold, who were like the Son of Man when he said, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not anywhere to lay his head." When the demonstration was over and I had finished writing my story, I went to the National Shrine at the Catholic University on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. There I offered up a special prayer, a prayer which came with tears and with anguish, that some way would open up for me to use what talents I possessed for my fellow workers, for the poor. As I knelt there, I realized that after 3 years of Catholicism, my only contact with active Catholics had been through articles I had written for one of the Catholic magazines. Those contacts had been brief, casual. I still did not know personally one Catholic layman. But when I returned to New York, I found Peter Morin, Peter the French peasant, whose spirit and ideas will dominate the rest of this book, as they will dominate the rest of my life. So Peter Morin is the other founder of the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy saw him very much, in her own words, as the poor man of his day. He was a St. Francis of modern times. Peter took gospel values of poverty seriously and stressed opposition to usury, which is one of the principal pillars of the capitalist banking system. It's the act of taking interest on loaned money, and the Catholic Church used to be very much against it. He was also, unlike the socialists and communists opposed to state power, he preferred that people solve their problems with mutual aid, as developed in the works of 19th century anarchist writers like Peter Kropotkin. Between them, Peter and Dorothy wanted to create a world where it was easier for people to be good and to love their neighbours. And to this end, they set up a newspaper, which was also called the Catholic Worker, to spread their ideas. So let's have a little look now at Catholic social teaching, and we'll start by introducing Pope Leo XIII, who's another one of my heroes. He was Pope between 1878 and 1903, which makes him the third longest serving Pope in history. And he was also the Pope who beatified our very own Blessed Hugh Farrington. So respect for that. In 1882, seeking to inspire a moral revival, he wrote encyclical Auspicato Concessium, an encyclical on the spirituality of St. Francis of Assisi. In it, he wrote that the Church calls on all the faithful to the practice of voluntary poverty during this materialistic age when Catholics are as tainted as well as everyone else. Franciscan spirituality has a huge influence on the Catholic worker movement. Obviously, the idea of living with just enough, or voluntary or gospel poverty, seeing poverty as a friend, really, just as St. Francis did. Reconnecting with nature, the Catholic worker believed in going back to the land and established farms to this end. Stewardship of the earth, living in community in order to care for the poor and marginalised. The Catholic worker always made a very clear distinction between their own voluntary poverty and the destitution that they sought to relieve, which was all around them. So Dorothy's own words were, poverty is one thing and destitution is still another. We have always made that distinction. The big document for Foundation of Catholic Social Teaching is another encyclical of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. This is a big document setting out Catholic teaching on social matters. We just run through some of the ground that it covers. The Church should concern itself with the conditions of working class people. There's the idea that labour is not a commodity, but at the very heart of the dignity of human life. The Church advocates a third way, neither capitalism or socialism, but distributed justice. To everybody, some property of their own. It introduces the idea of the preferential option for the poor. The Church takes their side. And it says the poor and helpless have a special claim to special consideration. The Church is rightly concerned through various enterprises with the works of mercy, and all work and use of wealth should be for the common good. I've got a few little quotations from Rerum Novarum here. I think ones that are particularly relevant. To misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain, or to value solely for their physical powers, that is truly shameful and inhuman. And he talked about how Catholics might band together in societies to help each other. The state should watch over these societies of citizens banded together in accordance with their rights, but it should not thrust itself into their peculiar concerns and their organizations, for things move and live by the spirit inspiring them and may be killed by the rough grasp of a hand without. The Catholic Worker had a 3-part program, and this was expounded through the newspaper and outreach to the poor in New York City. The movement grew very rapidly, and Catholic worker groups sprung up in cities across the USA. There's a really good film which I watched again this afternoon about Dorothy and the foundation of the Catholic Worker, called Entertaining Angels, starring Martin Sheen as Peter Morin. So the 3-part program was clarification of thought, which they did through expounding Catholic social teaching in the newspaper, and particularly through the column that Peter Morin wrote, which was called Easy Essays. We'll just have a little look at one of his easy essays. They're not really essays, we would understand them. They're more kind of like bullet point things, making specific points about Catholic teaching. People who are in need and not afraid to beg, give to people not in need the occasion to do good for goodness sake. So this is a central idea for them, that the person who is in need is actually giving a gift to the people who would help them, because he's giving that opportunity to help them. And whilst society may exclude them and may look down on them, actually these people are ambassadors of God and should be treated as such. And he makes the point at the bottom there that in other countries, with other faiths, Muslim countries, the teachers tell us that God commands hospitality, and hospitality is practiced in those countries. But the duty of hospitality is neither taught nor practiced in Christian countries. So there's that kind of prophetic voice going on in everything that Peter says. So the second part of the Catholic worker movement is works of mercy, which they called the scandal of the works of mercy. And the picture from their own newspaper of Christ standing in line for soup or whatever was being provided at the houses of hospitality. So throughout New York City and then across the states, the Catholic worker established houses of hospitality and later farms. And through these, they practiced the works of mercy. So let's remind ourselves of those corporal works of mercy: to feed the hungry, to give water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to house the homeless, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned or ransom the captive, and to bury the dead. And all of those, the Catholic workers had plenty of opportunity to practice. I'll just give a little list of the spiritual works of mercy: to instruct the ignorant, to counsel the doubtful, to admonish the sinners, to bear patiently those who wrong us, to forgive offences, to comfort the afflicted, and to pray for the living and the dead. The third part of the Catholic Worker Programme is the Green Revolution. And this really is ahead of its time. The Catholic worker was about getting back to the land and living more simply and being, as far as possible, self-sufficient. In the 1940s, the Catholic worker was addressing issues that Pope Francis wrote of in the last 10 years in his encyclical Laudato Si, on care for our common home. In the 1940s and 50s, whilst the work of the newspaper and the houses of hospitality in the cities continued, there was a shift of emphasis, mainly from Dorothy, towards establishing rural communities. These were to be self-sufficient experiments in communal living. Peter called them agrarian universities, where everything would be shared in common. In fairness, at the time, the farms turned out to be one of the least successful of the Catholic worker projects. What Dorothy Day describes in her diaries is a lot of birthing pains of community. They tended to attract suffering people. There were problems with drunkenness, mental illness, thieving, disharmony of all kinds, and quite simply, some people who just didn't want to do their share of the work. And yet the Catholic worker farms continue to this day. And there's a very successful one in Britain, not 40 miles from here, just outside Rickmansworth. And that farm has a special vocation to work with refugee women who have no recourse to public funds of any kind. They house these women, they teach them English, they teach them skills, and live in a self-sufficient community together. And they do a lot of advocacy work to help people with their asylum claims and this sort of thing. Dorothy believed strongly that the farms could point to a new way of relating to the earth and to a new kind of stewardship of God's creation. One of Dorothy's last campaigns, and the last time that she went to jail for her beliefs by standing on a picket line, was supporting the creation of the United Farm Workers Union in the 1970s. This was led by Cesar Chavez, a true giant amongst Catholics, in my humble opinion. In line with the principles of nonviolent direct action pioneered by Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King, with fasting, with a nationwide grape boycott, which went on for years, they managed to establish a union and to improve the lot of these migrant workers who were absolutely exploited. Cesar Chavez would deserve an entire evening on his own. Now, another important point about Catholic worker teaching is pacifism. The Catholic worker advocated a radical pacifism, so radical that when the US entered the World War II, the movement split and sales of the paper tumbled. Prior to the war, they'd been selling more than 150,000 copies per week. But Dorothy Day was uncompromising on pacifism, even if it meant that the movement lost support. And even when it made her unpopular with the church hierarchy, which it often did. Here's a diary entry from 20th June 1956. God runs the world, not Hitler or Stalin. We know he can bring good out of evil. God permits, so we must obey. I do not agree. Are we to stand aside and allow a Buchenwald because duly constituted authority decrees it? What a need of clarifying concepts of authority and obedience we have. I know that war is evil and there is no such thing as armed peace, so I must oppose war and all that makes for war, even if it goes against duly constituted authority. Our sense of values must be right. So in the 1950s, she refused to take part in civil defence drills. And these were exercises at which everybody in New York had to take part in, which was basically preparation for a nuclear attack. In refusing to participate, Dorothy was breaking the law. And so again, not for the first time, she was jailed for her belief with other Catholic workers. In the 1960s, she and a group of women fasted in Rome during the Second Vatican Council to try and influence the bishops to include a firm commitment to peace, and in particular against the development and use of nuclear weapons. Dorothy was a leading campaigner against the Vietnam War and felt the church hierarchy had not taken a clear stand against it. And many people have seen similarities between the work of Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa. And of course, they exist because both of them have this absolute concern for the poor. And as we can see from this picture, they certainly look as if they have plenty to talk about. However, there are differences, and I think the main one is Dorothy's willingness to be political because of her background in the revolutionary movement. And I think also because she did see her main task was being a writer, she felt that her role was to develop propaganda for her cause in a way that I think St. Teresa of Calcutta never would have done. Now, that brings us on to Dorothy Day and her continued political opinions. But I love this this picture of Dorothy on a demonstration in New York City. I mean, that's some placard. Why should the resources of human genius and the riches of the people turn more often to preparing arms than to increasing the welfare of all classes of citizens, and particularly of the poor? A quote from Pope John the 23rd. Fantastic. In those days, you could have a placard of that kind. This is Dorothy Day speaking on her anarchist.
How do you understand anarchism? What's the idea of the Catholic worker concerning anarchism?
Well, we are very much interested in anarchist thought because a man like Peter Kropotkin wrote a book called Fields, Factories, and Workshops. And he believed that all reform should begin from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And living as we are in a totalitarian era of Hitler's, Mussolini's, Stalin's, the whole philosophy of that part of the labor movement interested me. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers and the International Ladies Garment Workers both had cooperative housing for the poor. I don't know how many generations have lived in those houses. They're still going down the east side and up in the Bronx. They have their clinics, just like Cesar Chavez has 40 acres and a village for the retired Filipinos and a cooperative service station. The thing is, he also is interested in this type of building. It's very much a part of the labor movement where they, through their organization and through their dedication to bettering conditions, begin right where they are. And in France, they would call it a personalist position.
That's another important word from the Catholic.
Yes, well, at the same time the Catholic Workers started, a magazine started in Paris called Esprit, the Spirit. And it was dedicated to the personalist and communitarian revolution. And it has to begin with a personalist. And you begin with yourself. And you begin as an activist, changing yourself. Around the Catholic worker, they say, how is the Catholic worker run? Well, a person has authority because, not because he's been put in a position of authority. Everybody's a volunteer. But the person who, just by his very ability, takes over a situation is the authority, you might say. He's an authority on what he's doing. The person who knows how to bake bread automatically becomes the head of a baking project.
What happens when conflicts arise and when someone says, I can make bread better than you?
Well, if there's going to be a conflict, they can go ahead and take two separate tables and each bake their own bread. Take turns on the ovens, but we happen to have two ovens, too. No, there's the right to secession. That reminds you of the Quakers.
Yeah.
I went up to speak at a place in Westchester, and there were two Quaker meeting houses, not very far apart. And I said, what is this? Is this a hall or something of that sort? And they said, no, there was a disagreement between the two groups, and so they seceded and built another meeting house. So in an anarchist group, if there was a difference of opinion, why, the group was split.
The Catholic Worker Farm in upstate New York lives out the movement's anarchist and agrarian principles. Today, it attracts many young people who are seeking a religious, rural, and revolutionary lifestyle, a style which Dorothy, the Catholic Worker, has been living for over 40 years. Dorothy Day views this farm and others like it around the country as a new revolutionary development growing out of the peace movement. To many people, Dorothy Day is the leading example of how religious and nonviolent revolutionary life are related, and as such, she is one of the leading religious teachers and symbols of our time.
The Catholic Worker is essentially a school, you might say. I mean, it's a place where a lot of young people come to us. It's a anarchist movement. And they come to us to learn more about this point of view of beginning a change from the bottom up rather than from the top down. through unions and credit unions. You do away with banks by credit unions. You do away with interest. You do away with by mutual aid. You do away with possession of goods by sharing. Unions, credit unions, farming communes, cooperatives, all of these things
This is all
are part of the anarchist point of view. A non-violent anarchist point of view, which you find in a good deal of the European anarchist literature.
Just unmute myself. There we go. I mean, for me, just lovely to see that film with Dorothy Day. You really just get a feeling of her spirit there, and film which was made about 5 years before she died. So that would be 1975, somewhere around that. And you know what she's talking about, that possibility of grassroots action, of people doing things for themselves. Dorothy very much believed in people's ability to organise their lives for themselves and to support each other through mutual aid. Mutual aid is a key concept of the social philosophy known as anarchism. There was also already a tradition of Christian anarchism, perhaps best expressed in the writings of Leo Tolstoy in works like The Kingdom of God is Within You. This is the idea that Christians should detach themselves from Caesar's world, except in their efforts to reduce its suffering. Dorothy believed that the state was neither inevitable nor essential, and she did not believe that it was the best way to relieve poverty, which in many cases had been created or was sustained by the state. She believed in the love of Christ expressed through one's fellow human beings. As she herself said, go where Christ is suffering and share that suffering with him. That is love. Here's a local example. My experience managing organisations working with homeless people was that the more the state gave us money, the more one had to work to their agenda, which very often got in the way of working for the needs of our service users. In this parish, we have had the example through Bed for a Night of a service that was truly responsive to the needs of homeless people. Nothing was getting in the way of that essential gift relationship between human beings. And for this reason, Dorothy would not allow the Catholic worker even to be registered as a charity, because that would in itself tie it to the state. She also herself made sure that she didn't earn enough to pay income tax, because such taxes could be used to fund war. So, next slide. This is a quotation from, can we get that so it's not? That's it. Excellent. Brilliant. I think as Catholics, we can agree that values of the society we see around us are often very materialistic and superficial, and often very opposed to our beliefs about the sacredness of God's creation, and particularly our reverence for human life. Ours is a society which encourages the idea of there being winners and losers, where people are left abandoned because they are poor or disabled, or in some other way do not have what it takes to be a success. We are encouraged to consume things that no one needs in order to make us feel a little bit better. We are permitted to waste food and materials in pursuit of a convenient life. We are encouraged into a frenzy of competition with our fellow citizens, driving many people into anxiety, depression, addiction, or even madness. This is the society which has only become crazier over the past 40 years that Dorothy Day shone a light on, using the teachings of the Catholic Church, and proposed in her writings and by her example an alternative vision of how we might live together. Dorothy could often be very critical of church leaders, but it was never because she wanted them to be more liberal. Dorothy was actually extremely orthodox in her adherence to church teachings. It was because she wanted them to stand up more effectively for the teachings of Jesus Christ and his church. As Daniel Ellsberg wrote in his introduction to her diaries, Dorothy Day lived as though the truth were true. In the years since her death in 1980, a movement has grown up to have Dorothy Day declared a saint. She herself had said, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed so easily." Some of you might think that she'd be a very controversial appointment to the canon because of her previous life and perhaps because of her political beliefs. But if, like me, you believe that she just might be a saint, you can join the intentions of St. Procopius Abbey in New York State, with whom Dorothy Day was an oblate. And I will, there we go. Well done, Trace. And that is the prayer that they have made for her canonization. So that's really brought me to the end of what I wanted to say. It's a very brief walk through the life and work of Dorothy Day, and an even briefer look at Catholic social teaching. I continue to be inspired by Dorothy's example, but I guess that's not saying a great deal if it doesn't lead to repentance and action. This parish has an honourable record in social action. Participation in Bed for a Night, the work of the SVP, parishioners volunteering at the homeless drop-in. For me, one of the great scandals of this age is the existence not just of the destitution of homelessness, but the horrific fact of food poverty. Currently, there are 180 households who are using the Reading Food Bank every week. Even with this fantastic service, many people have very little in the way of fresh food, fruit and veg. This year, I'm going to be using my allotment to grow surplus for just this purpose, inspired by the Catholic workers. And if there's anyone else out there with an allotment or a veg patch in the garden, you're welcome to join me. Well, I'm very grateful for your attention, and if there are any questions, we still have a little bit of time, I think. So if you do have any questions, I will do my level best to answer them. But thank you for your attention, and God bless you all.